could you tell me your thoughts on the SPVM's increased budget for 2022, and the fact that it's the second highest increase in history?
Yeah, so the SPVM managed to finagle a $45 million operating budget increase out of the city this year. That's for 2022. They also managed to get an extra $20 million in capital investments. So that's not total capital investments. That's how much they increased the capital budget, which goes to things like buying cars, buildings, body cams, etc. Yeah, and it's the second biggest increase in the history of the SPVM. It's the biggest increase anywhere in Canada this year. It goes against majority opinion in Montreal, where people would like to see a decrease in the police budget. So it's really a phenomenal victory for the SPVM, for the police brotherhood, for the crime reporters in the Montreal media, and for, I think there are many people within government that wanted more funding for the police in order to make a very simple argument about how to keep Montrealers safe that actually goes against everything that we know about how to keep Montrealers safe. So it's atrocious, when we have political leaders who were saying 2 years ago during the second Black Lives Matter uprising that they wanted to reckon with police racism and violence. They've done nothing to address police racism and violence. They've ignored the demands of that movement, every one of them. And yet they'll be very happy to celebrate Martin Luther King Day. They'll be at every Black History Month event. They might show up to the February 14th march for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. There's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy. As Robin Maynard, a Toronto-based activist and author, said, that there's nothing more hypocritical than this increase in police budget and police repression after so many warm feelings were expressed 2 years ago. I guess I could say also that, the one thing that Projet Montréal campaigned on that was a good thing in terms of public security is that they plan to massively expand a pilot project that they introduced in the fall of 2021 in the Ville-Marie borough, where they've got a team of non-police workers who will intervene in certain kinds of calls in the Ville-Marie borough, usually ones involving homelessness and mental illness. And so the police have created many mixed squads where they'll add community workers, social workers, mental health workers to their police teams. And that does nothing except, improve the image of the police. It doesn't actually resolve any of the problems. But a non-police intervention team can do a lot. Projet Montréal campaigned on expanding that pilot project to all 19 boroughs of the city and having them operate 24 hours a day. And yet in the 2022 budget, they didn't provide the $5 million they said it would cost. What they did provide is the exact same amount that it's costed for a 4-month pilot project in one borough. So in other words, they're not doing it. And that was the one way in which they were heading in a slightly different direction. And we will go in that direction eventually. It's just a question of whether we'll have to boot Projet Montréal out of office in order to do that. I think this is ultimately a liability for them, that they don't have a single progressive or even liberal element of their platform when it comes to public security in a city that's hungry for real change.
Is essentially, there's been so many protests. There's been public outcry online. Ultimately, is voting the only way that we can really make change within this situation?
Well, it can't just be voting, obviously. And one thing I'd want to point out is that Montreal is one of 2 cities in Canada that have political parties. And that could potentially be a good thing. It probably has been at various points in time. Right now, we have a real problem where Projet Montréal has squatted the political spectrum everywhere from like Trotskyist to conservative. Their only real opponent is Assemblée Montréal, who thinks that the city should just keep taxes as low as possible and pick up garbage on time. So anyone who wants something more than that is often forced to vote for Projet Montréal. They beat many better progressive candidates in the last election from smaller parties. So people vote for Projet Montréal. A lot of progressives vote for them. And they managed to strangle out any progressive idea when it comes to public security. So looking across Canada this year, Montreal is the only major city that I saw where there was not a single city councillor speaking in favor of defunding the police. The only one. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people in Projet Montréal that want to defund the police. It means that they're not allowed to speak about that and they have to vote with the party. In many cities like Ottawa, for example, which is not governed in general any better than we are, because they don't have political parties, they have many city councillors that are allied with activists. Edmonton, same thing. Calgary, same thing. Toronto, same thing. I think that there are a lot of things we need to do right away. But I think that we, progressives, people on the left, need to really think about what this means, that we've got a political party that's managed to squat the center of the political spectrum and drown out any progressive voice. We can think about what that means. I think that we need people running in third parties. I said that last election and people did, and they lost. I still think that that's important. And I think that we need to figure out what it means to try to influence this government because through direct action, through building power, because so far they seem able to ignore the majority opinion on these issues. They managed to ignore, the two largest protests against police racism and violence in the city's history, and still get elected. I'm not a very good political strategist, honestly. So all I can say is that we need to debate this, and that we need, a wide range of tactics.
Thank you. I know you kind of already discussed this a little bit, but both provincial and federally, there is such a heavy reliance on police. I mean, sorry, not federally, provincially and municipally. But for example, I'm sure you've seen the 31 billion in COVID infractions, and the hiring of new officers, and even I've been kind of seeing like more cases of the French police kind of making complaints than being used. Why cops, both traditional like the SPVM or non-traditional like the OQLF, why are they being so heavily leaned on?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, when the pandemic began, there were a lot of people across Canada, and I was part of that those discussions where people were saying, this is going to augment, authoritarian measures. It's going to increase the use of the police, and it might even increase public support for the police because, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We want something to be done, and if the police can position themselves as a force that will help keep us alive, then, there are people have very good reasons for supporting the police. And I think that that's what's happened. Why, so we can ask, why did certain governments go full on with the police as the enforcers of public health measures, whereas others didn't, right? In Ottawa, for example, in the summer of 2020, they had city workers with green vests. They were either green or blue, going into parks and communicating social distancing rules, public health measures. They didn't have the power of arrest. They didn't have the power of giving tickets. And that worked just fine. We didn't do that here. We called on the police to enforce things. Then we also called on people to snitch on their neighbors if they were having a party, etc. And all this is in the interest of keeping people alive. And our grandparents were dying in long-term care facilities. So, I get the sentiment. It's just quite amazing that there was such a universal use of the police to keep us healthy and alive, rather than many other things that can be used. And and now we're into this phase where the CAC, for example, they want to blame the continuing pandemic on people who haven't been vaccinated. And I'm vaccinated. I think people should get vaccinated. But obviously, it's politically strategic to make it seem like the reason that we're suffering, that people are still dying, and that we're confined to our homes is because of a very small minority of people. And then because you minoritize them, you dehumanize them, then you can do whatever you want to them. And thankfully, they gave up on the idea of what they called an anti-vax tax, because there hasn't been an attempt to really understand the diverse reasons that people haven't gotten vaccinated, and using punitive measures to try to get the remainder of the population vaccinated just doesn't make sense when some of the people who haven't gotten vaccinated think the state is doing authoritarian overreach, and somehow like fining them is going to switch their perspective on this. Nora Loretto, who's an amazing Quebec journalist, co-host of the Sandy and Nora podcast, talks about are we interested in using the so-called carrot measure instead of the stick every time? Could we potentially incentivize getting vaccinated? Could we send people door to door saying, "We'll come vaccinate you right here, and here's a check so so you can live for the next 2 days"? You'd have to sell that, but it would work. You'd get a lot more people vaccinated. It would cost less. It would be a caring measure rather than a punitive measure, but it would be totally antithetical to the entire way that the CAQ has built its political fortunes. I mean, who are they? What is their platform? Their platform right now is anti-vaxxers are the whole reason that we're sick and inside. So no recognition of the ways that they've bungled this from the start, and then they want to make it seem like get us all hating a few hijab wearing women, as if they're decimating our society somehow, and people believe this. It's quite amazing that a Quebec nationalist movement that had been at one time about the liberation of a select group of settlers, but at least had some goal of social justice for a small group of people, has now been transformed into just a hate squad on finding people that they can punch down on. And then finally, I think that the fact that we've been incentivized to look at each other in terms of if we're obeying public health measures, we're encouraged to snitch on our neighbors, we're encouraged to see everyone around us as the reason that we're all suffering, I think has something to do with the fact that we're seeing these huge police budget increases across the board. The SPVM campaigned for more funding because of a small increase in certain kinds of gun crimes in 2021. They were saying there was an increase in gun crimes already in 2020 when there wasn't. In 2021, they turned out to be right. I guess if you say it often enough, every once in a while, you're right about it. But I think that, everyone really knows, I think, that more police isn't going to stop gun violence. It's certainly not going to stop violence in general. Decades of research shows that it's a far better investment. You could literally throw money into neighborhoods affected by gun violence and throw it at anything, and it's a better investment than more police. If you strategically invested in things that are proven to actually reduce violence, then so much the better. But that's it would take some work to really get that argument into the public opinion, into the sort of public discourse. I think primarily because the media is done covering Black Lives Matter because there aren't protests in the streets, so they think the movement is over. And anyone who's paying attention know that the movement is continuing. It's just not happening in the streets right now. And so the public discourse gets defined by Projet Montréal as the pseudo left, who are really center right, and Ensemble Montréal. That's the entire scope of the discourse we have right now. And so even though the public is I think very much ready for new approaches, and many people understand that investments in community violence prevention is far more effective than the police, there's nobody within the mainstream political debate that's standing for that, and so it doesn't get discussed in the media. We end up with more police. And who knows what's going to happen with gun violence this year? Certainly what they've done won't decrease it. It might decrease for other reasons because, crime, especially a crime that happens so little, like murders, It could drop in half this year. It could double this year, and to some extent that's sort of unexplainable. It could just do that, but certainly they haven't done anything to address it. So it very well could go up this year, and then we'll be in the same position again, where the police, the Brotherhood, the media, Ensemble Montréal, and Projet Montréal will be calling for more police again, because they were never willing to do the right thing in the first place.
Maybe this is too large of a question, but I'm just kind of curious talking about this. Why is it so ingrained in conservative and liberal values to rely on the police so much? If you're willing to break that down, if it's not too complicated.
I mean, I think there's so many ways to answer that. So, I'll make my attempt here, and I think I think what I'm going to say is part of the answer, but it's not all of it. I mean, to me, the foundation of liberal thought is the individual who calculates, who's rational, who makes decisions. It leads to a way of thinking about politics where you think about yourself as a basis for understanding the society. And so you think about, how can we create an incentive structure where people will behave differently? And so it's like you increase punishments, potentially you increase for bad behavior, potentially you also increase incentives for good behavior. And so it makes sense within that way of thinking that if you can have more police, increase the chances that people get caught for crimes, increase the penalties, the punishment, the violence that people experience for making those decisions, that somehow people will make different decisions. I mean, I think that that's the basis of modern liberal thought, and it shapes conservative thought too. I mean, in some ways it shapes conservative thought more than liberal thought, although I would call this like a liberal way of thinking. And I think that, the left doesn't think that way. And people who look at real human beings, how, social problems emerge, how they get solved, have to depart from that way of thinking. When I hear people from Coalition Posée, which is a coalition of Black street workers and social and community workers in the northeast of the city that's working hard to deal with gun crime, they're talking about, racialized youth who don't see a future for themselves after high school. They don't see something laid out for them. And so it's just this vague, cloudy period of their life where they don't see any great future for them. And so try to tell somebody like that they shouldn't, get involved in a drug economy, or they shouldn't get involved in some kind of street organization that gives them a sense of pride, dignity, and respect. People who get involved in gun violence don't calculate in the way that criminologists, the police, and liberal to conservative political thinkers do. They're making decisions that I think are not in their best interest ultimately, but that absolutely make sense in their context. And so, we need to get away from the idea that if we increase the punishment for things that we don't like, that will make them decrease. That doesn't happen. It's not what's going on. No research blows that assumption out of the water. And so, if we're actually concerned about having, a safer city, then we need to think about what creates safety. And that means giving up on punishing people who do things we don't like to the maximum possible extent, because those are totally different projects. If we're interested in the future of the French language, we need to do a whole bunch of things beyond just cracking down on a service worker who greets someone in English. I mean, I don't think anyone who really looks deeply at what's going on with the French language thinks that the problem is a few service workers who maybe didn't speak French in that moment for whatever reason, or didn't have the chance to learn French. I mean, presumably you'd want to massively invest in people's ability to learn the language. You'd want to ensure that people can work in French, regardless of the workplace. you'd want to deal with the fact that we have a language policy that essentially makes it really hard for francophones and allophones to learn English unless they're middle class. So basically we have like François Legault and like the elite Québécois who want to restrict access to English to working class people, ignoring the fact that bilingualism has been essential to their quality of life, the careers that they've managed to create for themselves. Like we'd have to deal with that contradiction. I'm in favor of like measures to promote French, but policing is not the answer.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Trying to think. I have a few things to ask. Where to start? Okay. In the piece that you wrote, you discussed diversity training as reformist reforms. Could you just explain this a little bit more?
Sure. So, since the urban uprisings of the 1960s, which were predominantly in U.S. cities, were often set off by police shooting, but we also had smaller uprisings against police racism and violence in Canada. We had a smaller racialized population, and so we had major uprisings against police violence by French Canadians, by Québécois people in Montreal around the same time, with some of the same issues, although white people, no matter how subjugated they might be by language and ethnicity, are never going to face the police violence that Black and Indigenous people face. But since that time, there's been a whole series of reforms that have been introduced to try to deal with police racism and violence. Some people call them procedural reforms, where you try to modify like police processes, but you don't touch the institution. Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls them reformist reforms, where they change a lot of things except the fundamental power of an institution to use violence against marginalized people. And so, practically speaking, those reforms include like anti-racism training or multicultural training. They include hiring more women cops and more cops of color, more Indigenous cops. It includes doing foot patrols, bike patrols. It includes going to community meetings, creating partnerships with community organizations. So all of these things have been tried since the 1960s in the US. Most of these things began in late 70s, early 80s in Canada. And they don't change anything. And so we shouldn't expect them to change anything because they don't alter the institution in any way. I don't think that police, are a systemically racist institution because the individuals who work there are more racist than the average person. They might be more racist than the average person. I mean, they chose a particular career that is known to be, with an institution that's known to be racist. So, it might say something about the kind of people who choose that job, but it's not fundamentally because of that. It's because of the role of the police in a white supremacist capitalist society. So we know that theoretically, and then practically we know that we've seen what it does, and it doesn't do anything. When the police did the best multicultural training they've ever done in Montreal was between 86 and 88. They trained the entirety of the police force. They were month-long trainings where they had community members come in and talk to them about like the history of slavery, colonization, all this stuff. The police went on to kill more unarmed Black people than at any point in the history of the SPVM. So, the people who killed all those Black people had taken that training. It doesn't do anything. And of course, the police are going to trot out these reforms as a solution every time there are movements in the streets, that there are rising criticism of the police. I wouldn't expect them to do otherwise, and I don't blame them for doing that. What's quite amazing is that we have political leaders who seem to think that these reforms will do something. If they do think that, it's because they haven't taken 5 seconds to look at any of the research or to understand that those reforms are in place. Like, we can't improve the SPVM by adding multicultural training because they've been trained since the 80s. The police force that we have is a police force that's been trained. If we want to talk about, cops of color, we can look at, we could ask people in neighborhoods like Saint Michel, Saint Léonard, Montréal Nord, what they think of Black and Latino and Arab cops. They don't think that they treat them any better. We can look at like the Baltimore Police Department, where almost half the police department is Black. And we know something about the Baltimore Police Report because they killed police department because they killed Freddie Gray, and there was an uprising then. 6 cops were involved in the killing of Freddie Gray. 3 of them were Black. 2 of them were women. So like, that's not going to do anything. And I think that the left obviously needs to be conscious of the fact that these reforms have already been put in place, that the police are reformed in that sense, and to really look at like what is going to reduce the power of the police department to enact violence against people, what's going to challenge, what's going to reduce the resources that it has to surveil people, to send people to prison, to harm people, and what's going to challenge the dominant, ideology of policing, that there are people out there who are doing wrong, who are harming people, and that the way to address that is to punish them as much as possible. If we're not doing that, then we're not doing anything at all. And and those points that I'm making, are ones that have been made by Miriam Kaba and Critical Resistance, and the resources that they put in place over the last 25 years are really, really instructive. And they're the reason that I'm able to say these things. And I think if people want to think about policing and public security, racial justice and social justice, there are resources that people need to spend a little bit of time looking at it. And they're so well done that I'm talking like 5 or 10 minutes of your time, and you'll be like, okay, I get it.
Thank you, Ted. I guess lastly, I just want to ask, in the graph that was included in the article, displaying how Montreal has the most officers compared to any other Canadian city. I guess the way Projet Montréal is moving, do you have concerns that this number and the budget as well will just keep increasing year after year? And ultimately, what does that mean for Montreal?
Well, I think that Projet Montréal, is a centrist party with a right-wing public security platform. So I think that they will stick with the status quo unless they're forced to do otherwise. And so the status quo is a changing thing. In the past year, the police brotherhood, the crime reporters, etc., pushed this narrative that we're in real danger of gun violence. And so the status quo was that, well, we need more police, and they gave us more police. If this year there isn't as much discussion of gun violence in the media, maybe Projet Montréal will just give the police the usual 2 or 3% budget increase at the end of the year. I don't know where they're going, but I know that their response to any concerns about public security is more police. So either we need to be able to build a consciousness that we're actually an incredibly safe city. These little increases in certain kinds of crime don't make the city any less safe. And so it isn't a crisis. And we need to be able to work, in communities where there are some problems of security, to allow people to work through their analysis. Because I think that when people are sitting around in a group and are asked what makes them feel safe, what they need to feel safe, almost spontaneously they will list a whole bunch of things that aren't the police. So I often rely on research on what actually keeps people safe, what reduces violence, etc. But I think that people already kind of know this if they're given a venue to talk about it, and that's where the media isn't interested in the Black Lives Matter movement anymore. But one of the places that the movement is still happening is having discussions, creating venues where people can talk through some things. And moving from, we had majority support for defunding the police in 2020, but I don't think it was like super rooted, I don't think that necessarily all the people who said, yes, defund the police could necessarily explain why, what that means. And people are also saying defund the police because we don't want police racism or violence. We need to be able also to say we want to defund the police because we want a safer city. And that's requires a little bit more thinking, I think. And people are doing that. And so I think that that's something that's really hopeful, is that this kind of popular education and mobilizing is continuing to happen. I think that Sandy Hudson from Black Lives Matter Toronto kind of said it. Once you put in the public mind the idea that reducing the size of the police, if you reinvest that money elsewhere, can make us safer, it's really hard to put that genie back in the bottle. I'm not sure that that's right, but I choose to believe it because it's hopeful, and I want to believe in people. I don't believe in political parties. I'll vote for one, but I don't believe in them. But I do believe in people, and I think that that's where we're headed.
Thank you so much, Ted. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share is important to consider?
No, sometime later, we could talk about the neighborhood police stations. Like, we can talk about that now if you want to, but it's going to be in the news all year.
Okay.
This SPVM says that they need to close some neighborhood police stations to get their budget under control, and so they're going to draw this out all year. It's going to be in the media. It's ridiculous.
But budget under control, what does that mean? Is it not increased? So they're closing down these stations to essentially save money.
So the SPVM and the Police Brotherhood, they're working full time to shape public opinion. They have tons of people making good salaries doing this work, whereas activists are doing this in their spare time, unpaid. And so they've been very successful. And so they mobilized all 2021 to make us afraid of gun crime, to make us think that there's way more gun crime than before, and that we need more police to solve it. All those things are false. They seem to be moving into a second phase now. So the SPVM overspent on their budget for last year by $51 million. We gave them a budget, and they just spent whatever they felt like spending. They went over by $51 million, and the city just paid the bill. Meanwhile, the Public Transit Authority is short $43 million for obvious reasons, because people aren't using public transit as much because of COVID, and they're forced to reduce service. So we have an incredibly unaccountable institution. They're an unaccountable institution. They're not accountable for their violence and their racism, but they're not even accountable for their budget. So they overspent by $51 million. And now Sylvain Caron, the director of the SPVM, says that we need to close neighborhood police stations in order to save money. And so the city has something like 29 or 30 neighborhood police stations. In French, they're called Poste de Quartier. They were put in place in the late 1990s, in 1997, 98, 1996, 97. And, a lot of Montrealers really like the police stations. So it's a quite brilliant strategy. It's like the only way that we can control, you can either let us spend as much money as we want, or we're going to cut back on the one thing that you like. So this is their new phase. And we have a bunch of politicians who are fighting to preserve the Poste de Quartier on the grounds that we want the police to know us. We like the foot patrols. We like the bike patrols. We like that they're at our community events, etc. And it's like, you've totally, totally missed it. First of all, those things that they like, foot patrols, bike patrols, community meetings and stuff, that was implemented in the early 80s, 15 years before the Poste de Quartier. So if you like those things, you can argue for those things. That's not an argument for the Poste de Quartier. Also, as we've talked about, those things, you can like them if you want. If you probably like them because you're a middle-class person, probably because you're a white person, because none of those things, knowing the police, like having them know you, doesn't actually address police racism and violence. The cops that are tasked with building relationships with community, those are specific cops. They're not the people who are making the arrests, giving the tickets, shooting people down the street. And so we're going to be in this situation this year where we're going to have this prolonged debate. The SPVM says that they're going to consult the population. Then the city said that they'll consult the population. So we're going to have this debate all year about whether we should close the Poste de Quartier or allow the police to spend whatever they want. And it's amazing because there are ideas on how to reduce police spending. The majority of the public is in favor of them. And so the police have managed to turn, and the Brotherhood have managed to move the debate onto terrain where nothing's good's going to happen. Like, personally, I don't care if they close the Poste de Quartier. It doesn't matter to me. I don't think they should close. I don't think they should stay open. Like, it doesn't matter. I want to see the police defunded. So they've managed to bring the debate onto a train where the outcome doesn't really matter. It's not going to make any difference for public security. It's not going to make any difference for police racism and violence. You're just going to have a polarized debate between two positions that are both irrelevant.
Is it almost like an ultimatum?
Yeah, I think so, I mean, and this is a particular kind of ultimatum. I mean, this is what the kind of ultimatum that the SPVM pulls off. The Brotherhood can pull out the ultimatum that if you piss us off, we'll just go on strike. And they don't mean we'll actually go on strike. They'll just stop enforcing anything. So under Coder, they stopped issuing tickets. But the traffic tickets are a source of revenue for the city. So they were depriving the city of money, and they just did it. They have a job to do, and they just didn't do it. They went to work every day, they got their paycheck, and they just didn't do it. So that's the kind of strike that the Brotherhood can pull off, where they just stop doing their job. And then, of course, like if they say like we're resisting right now, and then there's like a shooting, which there's a shooting every once in a while in a major city, it's bound to happen. They'll say it's because that they weren't there to stop the criminals, as if they're like so great at stopping shootings when they're doing their job with enthusiasm. So yeah, it's an ultimatum.
It sounds like a temper tantrum.
Yeah, it does. It does. Although Sylvain Caron he's very calm. He's a very calm child, whereas like Yves Francoeur, the president of the Brotherhood, he's more of a petulant teenager.
Oh my goodness. That is so silly. So the city is just willing to front that bill, but they're in comparison, they're not willing to invest more in public transit. Like that's the trade-off.
No, and the city's been asked. I mean, the media don't ask them these questions apparently, but citizens have been asking the city these questions at city council meetings. Like, what are you going to do to ensure that the police don't just go over their budget by $51 million again next year? And the response by Alain Vaillancourt, who's in charge of public security for the city, he said, well, there are certain things, that if they happen, the police need to do it. If there's an investigation that needs to happen, they need to do it. If there's a protest, they need to be there. And so basically what they're saying is the police have absolute discretion to spend as much money as they want. And, theoretically, they should have to have a justification for it. They should have to say, well, we had to do more investigations this year, or there were more protests this year. But, no one's going to ask them for that justification. So effectively, they can do whatever they want. Yeah, and the public transit authority is supposed to cut back on service, so like nurses and essential workers can wait twice as long for the bus. I've suggested that we can ask the police to keep them company while they're waiting for the bus. We got enough cops that we can send some cops to like do some stand-up comedy for the nurses while they're waiting for the bus.
I love that.